In a line that shook me to the core, poet and essayist Adrienne writes, "This is the oppressor's language, yet I needed to talk to you." Have you ever wanted to express something to someone, but you just couldn't find the words? No language could possibly adequately convey the sentiment. Friend trivializes the blood brother kinship that's more of a soul bond than any biological family. Sex doesn't capture the experience of cosmic union. Ex-boyfriend seems to flatten the experience of the memory of that person in your bones. How incredible it is that language can almost get it right and yet totally miss the mark. Love we say, God we say, family we say, and the words get it all wrong. As the famous Count Alfred Korzybski wrote,
"Whatever you say something is, it isn't."
In fact, it's almost as if the things that matter most are the things that are least expressible of all.
What we feel most has no name.
I dream of lost tongues, abandoned words that can express the inexpressible, give name to the nameless. But what if this inexpressibility, this namelessness, isn't just an innocent happenstance, an unfortunate coincidence, a quirk of language, but deliberate and strategic? Hermeneutical injustice refers to the harm that occurs when marginalized groups lack the capacity to make sense of their own experiences because we haven't developed the language or concept to articulate them.
The very act of naming has been, until now, a white cis-het upper-class male prerogative.
Victims of hermeneutical injustice don't just accidentally lack these concepts. Language has largely been created by and for dominant groups. Content warning for a brief discussion of CSA. I'll put a timestamp here if you want to skip this part. Something I've often discussed on this channel is that when I experienced CSA, it wasn't so much the sexual acts that kept me up at night, but the way he used to look at me, the subtle cues of his body near mine, the creepy stories he used to tell me. Grooming, paedophilic culture, objectification doesn't quite capture it. Without a word for an act, I cannot name it. It remains unspeakable. The courtroom certainly didn't take this violence into account. All they cared about was the specific sexual acts. But even then I noticed an impoverishment in our language. He choked me with his dick, sounds pornographic. He inserted his penis into my mouth, sounds clinical. I performed oral sex, sounds trivial. It's almost like I'm using a language that wants to make it as difficult as possible to describe this kind of violence. For me, the incapacity to understand was in many ways worse than the actual sexual violence itself. I remember an almost tangible sense of relief when the sexual acts started, because at least now I have something nameable to point to, something I and others recognize as real. And yet I never called it rape, because notions of strangers attacking shaped my perception of real rape. So even when a concept does exist, if there's a conflict between its meaning at the formal policy level and those at the everyday level, it can still lead to a failure of recognition. For the 7 years I knew him, my incapacity to name it left me unable to protest it or enlist help to stop it. Adrienne Rich's words once again awoke something within me when she talked about
women struggle to name the world, to explode the oppressor's language.
But this, of course, is not just the problem for women. Terms like systemic racism and police profiling only became part of mainstream conversations relatively recently. And for centuries, rigid binary definitions of gender and sexuality have dominated, leaving many people without the frameworks or language to describe their identities. Reflecting on their experiences of being black and queer, civil rights activist James Baldwin said his issue with English is that it reflects none of his experience. He can't find himself within this language.
considering such things makes you aware of how much your knowledge of the world is conventional knowledge. A selection of particular things to which you attend, to which you have been brainwashed to notice, and the rest is disregarded.
But what if this goes beyond specific marginalized groups to a hermeneutical injustice we all experience as a culture and society as a whole? Could the language of love, exes, friendship, and family be constrained by dominant romantic and monogamous paradigms, limiting the range of relationships we value and experience? Could the concept of God as a daddy in the sky, benevolent tyrant, big papa, exclude our awareness of something more animistic, spiritual, unifying? Could notions of sex, limited to rigid gendered sexual scripts, shut us off from the meeting of different bodies and souls in a profound emotional, spiritual, and even transcendent union? What might love, relationships, God, and sex be if our concepts were broader? In other words, what is expressible and inexpressible encodes and incarnates certain values, actions, and worldviews. We learn what exists, what is normal, what is possible and impossible. It is therefore a fruitful terrain for the legitimization of power and control. As psychologist Boris Kagalitsky put it,
deprived of an adequate complement of words, the people are unable to express thoughts contrary to the standards imposed on them and become helpless and easily managed. Even if they are unhappy or dissatisfied with conditions, they are unable to put that discontent into words, much less actions. Control is more easily maintained at the linguistic level than through police repression and brute force. The fewer options the ruling regime has of achieving sweeping political control, the more it will resort to indirect methods of control, such as the manipulation of language, to preserve the existing order.
This raises the questions: what are the words we do not yet have? How can we make language accountable to the truths of our experience, and give name to the nameless so it can be thought? When theoretical physicist Werner Heisenberg famously declared,
"We've reached the limits of our language,"
recognizing ordinary language as inadequate for describing the nuances of quantum physics, his words struck a chord with me because in my brief phase of becoming obsessed with quantum physics, I just couldn't get my head around basic concepts until I picked up a German book and started reading in my other native tongue. And suddenly ideas that seemed obscure in English started to make sense. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, for example, is much easier to understand in its German translation, Unschärferelation. Vagueness relation or blur relation more accurately captures the inherent blurriness of quantum states better than the term uncertainty implies. This shift in language altered my understanding completely, showing me how language can alter perception and even comprehension of reality. Since then, I've come to learn that many indigenous languages might be even better suited to understanding quantum physics, and may even hold the key to understanding the nature of reality, like time, space, and causality.
David Bohm was interested in Blackfoot metaphysics because the English language has to become a lot more process-oriented in trying to explain some of the things that happens in the subatomic level. And that process-oriented approach to English he was referring to as the real mode. And that's what he was working on. And when I understood that, I said to him, hey, Blackfoot, which I grew up in, is a whole lot more process-oriented and so on. And I jokingly told him, hey, quit the real mode, hey, just learn Blackfoot, you know? In the Blackfoot mind, nothing is static. Everything is always on the move. And you can never predict what is going to happen. So that the only thing you can really say is happening is the now.
In other words, it would seem that languages dissect the world in different ways. When we learn a language, we learn to see reality through that language's lens.
And therefore, if you study that language, you begin to see that there are ways of thinking based on principles, based on a kind of logic that is not one's own common sense. And therefore, by studying this very different thing, you get a perspective on what your own assumptions are. See, most of us don't know what our assumptions are. We operate on principles which we haven't really examined. And by studying a completely different culture, you begin to understand what your principles are.
This idea that language shapes reality is known by various names, such as linguistic relativity, linguistic determinism, but these days it's most commonly referred to as the Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis. A famous paper of Sapir's claims,
Human beings do not live in the objective world alone, but are very much at the mercy of the particular language which has become the medium of expression for their society. It is quite an illusion to imagine that one adjusts to reality essentially without the use of language, and that language is merely an incidental means of solving specific problems of communication or reflection. The fact of the matter is that the real world is, to a large extent, unconsciously built up on the language habits of the group. We see and hear and otherwise experience very largely as we do because the language habits of our community predispose certain choices of interpretation. No two languages are ever sufficiently similar to be considered as representing the same social reality. The worlds in which different societies live are distinct worlds, not merely the same worlds with different labels attached.
if Sapir and Whorf are correct, the implications for science, politics, philosophy, anthropology, amongst other fields, are profound. How much of what we consider universal truths, taken as self-evident, rather reflect the worldview specific to the languages in which they were developed? What if our current philosophical, political, and scientific paradigms, built largely off of Eurocentric linguistic structures, are but a partial vision of a much larger, richer reality? At a time where we're faced in the world with so many crises and critical questions, could it be that the languages upon which we tend to rely are ill-equipped for the tasks at hand? Poet and essayist Audre Lorde once said,
"For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change."
English is thought to be a particularly well-endowed language, that its intrinsic value explains its global spread. But in reality, the biggest reason English is the world language is because it was violently imposed through colonization, linguistic imperialism, and the killing off of other languages.
Language has always been a factor in a process of colonization. The colonizer always, in all situations, suppresses the language or the languages of the colonized and elevates their own language.
Right.
If you can suppress their language and their naming system, they'll soon forget who they are.
When a language is endangered, it is not just the words that will be lost. Language is a carrier of heritage, values, and worldviews.
Each of these languages holds a little piece of information or a lot of information, can hold information about medicines and health, can hold information about the constellations in the sky. And that's an information that if you lose the language, you lose that connection with that place, with that way of thinking, with tens of thousands of years of that language's lineage.
So the dominance of English and other Eurocentric languages across the globe has transferred more than just vocabulary to indigenous communities. In killing off a language and taking on the language of the oppressor, white Eurocentric ways of being become the invisible or inaudible norm, whilst other ways of being are quaint, quirky, or backwards. As the psychiatrist Frantz Fanon writes in Black Skin, White Masks,
a man who possesses a language possesses as an indirect consequence the world expressed and implied by this language.
Language is therefore a way to dominate and control the mental universe of the colonized.
Economic and political control can never be complete or effective without mental control. The domination of a people's language by the languages of the colonizing nations was crucial to the domination of the mental universe of the colonized. In my view, language was the most important vehicle through which that power fascinated and held the soul prisoner. The bullet was the means of the physical subjugation. Language was the means of the spiritual subjugation.
So can the master's tools ever really dismantle the master's house? As long as liberation is imagined, spoken, and fought for within the confines of the language of conquest and slaughter, it risks being a renovation to the master's house, not its dismantling. To truly dismantle it, we must ask ourselves what languages, what ways of being, what worldviews are still waiting to be heard. Liberation may begin not in the master's tongue, but in reclaiming the silences it sought to erase. When you first clicked on this video, what crossed your mind when you heard my Southern British accent? Did my words carry a subconscious authority, sophistication, or intelligence? As you continue to watch, you might notice how my soft feminized voice, my hyperbolic language, my conversational tone might alter your perception of my competence. Would you assume I'm less listenable, less knowledgeable, perhaps even boring? Maybe you're one of the people who leaves me a helpful comment telling me how I should improve my speaking. Whatever the case might be, I wouldn't really blame you. Aside from speaking like a woman, I possess a lot of linguistic capital, fluency in and comfort with a high-status worldwide language, and the dialects, accents, and ways of speaking of upper-class, white, cisgender men. By virtue of having linguistic capital, I was able to master interviews to land places at prestigious elitist universities and good jobs. Speaking the right language opened the doors for upper-class social networks, resources, and communities. One of these opportunities I received was an internship with the United Nations, and what became abundantly clear to me whilst I was there is that English is the language of the global panopticon, the standard of international organizations, media, education, literacy, and law.
The problem with Africa and the formerly colonized as a whole is that the whole intellectual community operates within European languages. In other, the entire intellectual production of ideas is in foreign languages or it's in European languages.
I think in general it's easier for me to engage in discussions around world events because my linguistic capital grants me access to the specialized jargon of media, policy, education, and law. Those without linguistic capital, on the other hand, are encouraged to give up their agency or involvement in social and political issues because coming across word stew, it's easy to dismiss it as too complex or best left to the experts. My linguistic capital and capacity to understand the language of law was also what helped me get my abuser locked up. I was better able to understand the jargon the lawyers used to manipulate me during questioning, to feel relatively at home amongst the legal professionals who spoke like me. And I have no doubt that my southern British accent gave me more credibility in the eyes of the jury than my working class abuser. Even here on social media, I'm sure that I enjoy enhanced visibility than my non-English counterparts because all the search engines are optimized in my favor. When researching for these videos, most publications are catered to me, making it easy for me to devour large amounts of information, enhancing my credibility. Constant indoctrination into English language exceptionalism makes it easier for me to seem worthy of being listened to. I, like most creators, am encouraged to self-censor the words I use, the topics I address, to fit dominant narratives and avoid demonetization, further consolidating conformity to one homogenized, standardized, ideal way of speaking. That being said, whether it's at uni, the workplace, or on social media, my way of speaking will never carry the same power and prestige as that of men of otherwise similar demographics. Just as non-white people have to constantly code switch to fit the language of white people, or the working class to fit the language of the upper class, I constantly find myself switching to try to speak the language of men. Like I constantly have to avoid saying like. My linguistic capital also diminishes when I speak German versus English because I speak Austrian German because I'm half Austrian, and Austrian is generally seen as more folksy than the purity of standardized German. But when I'm speaking English and people find out I speak German or now Spanish, people are always so impressed because German and Spanish are prestigious second languages, whilst the multilingualism of my black and brown friends who speak lesser second languages like Swahili are instead met with constant fear-mongering about the threat to the English tongue. As we learn to internalize this linguistic elitism, minority languages and ways of speaking can start to feel a sense of inferiority. I definitely feel less competent in German than English when I speak amongst men than amongst women. And if it's like that for me, I can't imagine how it is for people who've had years of indoctrination into their ways of speaking or their languages as being backwards, primitive, or stupid.
The nearest parallel is the case of physically abused children who end up identifying with their abusers, or captives who end up carrying out the mission of their captors with sincerity and even resolve. If you look at a common thread in the export of English in Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and Africa particularly, was the constant association of extreme humiliation and negativity with native languages, and the corresponding value and prestige accorded English in colonial education factories.
So linguistic capital is central to the perpetuation of unjust power structures, creating winners and losers in the world system, further consolidating power and control in the hands of a few. So if you're one of the people who's watching this video because you, like me, tend to privilege the voices of the linguistically elite, it might be worth reflecting on how perhaps in talking to you in the language that hides the loss of so many tongues, though I might be complaining to you about power and oppression, am I automatically excluding the vast majority of the population across the globe, the disenfranchised, the marginalized, the working class, from the conversation? Am I further muting minorities, casting their ideas, identities, and voices into the periphery? Can liberation ever truly be spoken about, fought for, and realized within the confines of the linguistically elite? Me and my little neuro-spicy brain often feel like an alien on this planet. I don't understand these local humans, their cultures, their ways. I'm often getting myself into a pickle because I don't get the rules right. I feel I really belong in another dimension. I'm just here temporarily as an anthropologist from Mars. But what if in a sense we are all aliens on this planet that we think of as our home? We don't speak the language of nature or its creatures. Maybe the pickle humanity has got ourselves in, therefore, is in part because we've forgotten how to listen to its beings, its ways, its cultures. But this isn't actually the case for all people. Amongst countless indigenous communities across every continent, language isn't just something humans have, but rather a property of the surrounding earth, animals, and cosmos itself. Their worldview is animistic, that is to say, everything is alive with its own consciousness and spirit.
The land is my own land, and it's where the language come from, you know. There's language all around you. Everything we see has language. Everything that moves has language. All the food source and waters, rivers, they all have names. And that's how we can describe what it is, when it's something that a lot of people can't even describe today in English, you know.
Obviously, these other beings do not speak in human tongue. They speak in signs, rhythms, movements, or articulate themselves in the surrounding shadows. Elders will give advice like, you should go among the standing people, or go spend some time with those beaver people. People don't just learn from plants, they learn from plants called plant teachers. Chief of the Native American Lakota people wrote that for the old Indian,
to sit or lie upon the ground is to be able to think more deeply.
And the earth was
a library, and its books were the stones, leaves, grass, brooks, and the birds and animals.
Upon signing over their lands to the US government, young chief of the KU Sioux tribe pondered,
I wonder if the ground has anything to say. I wonder if the ground is listening to what is said.
In all these ways, these other cultures are reminding us of the capacity of other beings as our guides, teachers, and holders of wisdom. English, on the other hand, confers an inanimate, unalive, insignificant status to anything that is not human.
In English, you are either a human or you are an it. The English language gives us no choice. It imprisons us in this idea of objectification of nature.
To itify nature within these traditional cultures would be unthinkable because there's nothing that fundamentally distinguishes the earth, the cosmos, the animals from people. A word for nature doesn't even exist in many of these cultures. Instead, they're classified literally as persons, even relatives. Hence, a rock might be addressed with the same level of respect and reverence as an ancient elder, grandfather. And since everything is alive, we humans have to take care of our speaking and use our words responsibly because we never know what other beings are listening.
When you feel that everything is speaking, you know everything is also listening. And so how does that affect your speaking and what you have to say? Notice how it shifts the way you speak when you're aware that there are all these other presences listening.
Here, language is often thought to have a sort of magical power capable of influencing the world around us.
Old languages, oral cultures generally, use language not to represent the world or to talk about that mountain over there, or to talk about the weather, or to talk about that stand of trees. No, they're just as much using language to talk to the mountain, to call the sun up out of the ground in the morning, as many folks in the Pueblos here do every dawn, to speak to the moon, to conjure clouds out of the fathomless blue so that they can gather and get heavy with rain and drop it upon the high desert here. That is, language is a way of calling oneself into the presence of the forest, of calling oneself into the presence of that mountain, or of calling that mountain into relation with me, and then listening for its reply. Language is a way of bridging the distance, the gap between oneself and another, much like when we use it to say to a friend or to a sweetheart, I love you.
So perhaps we need to re-remember ourselves as aliens, step out of the boundaries of conventional thought and language to grant the natural world the same level of personhood as humans.
And so I have a modest proposal for you. Could we imagine coming to greater respect and reciprocity with all the other beings on the earth with a linguistic switch? In the Sky Woman story, the geese, the muskrat, the sturgeon, the loon were not objects, right? They were persons. They were persons and beings that should be referred to in just that way, conveying not human superiority, but human family. And so this experiment relates to how could we animate English inspired by Anishinaabe and many other indigenous languages?
In order to do this, we must come to our senses, reacquaint ourselves with this living, breathing, animate planet, slip out of ordinary language and enter into heightened reciprocity to the beings around us, listening to an expressive, singing, crying landscape, to a world that speaks. In reflecting on the words of Adrienne Rich, this is the oppressor's language, yet I need it to talk to you. Theorist Bell Hooks poignantly writes, I know that it is not the English language that hurts me, but what the oppressors do with it. Language can limit our worldview or illuminate a much larger, richer reality, erase entire peoples, or give name to the nameless so it can be thought. Consolidate power in the linguistically elite, or give voice to the silences of the periphery. Fortify the master's house or be its dismantling. Slice us off from the natural world, or help us be literate in the lingua franca of the living world. Ultimately, language is a battleground, a site of ideological struggle, both a weapon of oppression and a tool of liberation. And so the question is, what will we do with it? I would love to hear so much in the comments your experiences with language, how it's shaped your reality and worldviews. If you like this video, you might like my video on a revolution in our consciousnesses. I'd really appreciate if you could support the channel via becoming a patron, leaving a one-time tip on PayPal or Ko-fi, liking, sharing, subscribing. Thank you so much to my current patrons for helping to make this channel possible. Thank you so much to Opt Out and JC Finley for editing this video. I appreciate you so much, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!